I flew to Florida and found my daughter barely holding on while my son-in-law was out hosting a party. I will never forget how the truth struck me the instant I stepped inside, because that moment became the turning point of my life as a father, revealing more than I was ready to face. And as I stood frozen in the doorway, I had no idea the decisions waiting for me that night would shape the path of our family in ways I could never have imagined. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. I still remember the heaviness of the air that night, the way the world seemed to hold its breath, and I knew something inside me was about to change forever. You see, when you are an old man, you carry decades on your back. You carry the echoes of laughter that has faded, and you carry the scars of choices you made long ago. And on that night, all of it came rushing back to me in one long flood of memory and dread. I had raised my daughter through storms of grief after her mother passed. I had held her hand when she cried for a mother who would never return. And I had promised her in the quiet of the night that I would never let her feel abandoned. I worked myself raw, 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to make sure she had shoes that fit, books that opened doors, and food that warmed her belly. And for years I thought that all those sacrifices would be enough to shield her from harm. Life is cruel, though, and sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones who betray you most deeply. But I had not yet learned just how far betrayal could stretch until the day I booked that flight. I remember gripping the ticket so tightly that my knuckles went white, every second in the airport dragging as though the universe wanted to test how much pain a father's heart could endure. I told myself she would be fine, that perhaps the call I had received was exaggerated, that maybe things were not as dark as they had sounded, but in the hollow of my chest I knew better. I replayed every moment I had shared with her, from the first time I lifted her out of her crib and felt her tiny hand clutch mine, to the afternoons we spent reading together when she was in school, to the day she walked across that stage in her cap and gown while I sat in the audience weeping because I knew her mother would have been so proud. Those memories became both my comfort and my torment, because I could not escape the thought that all of it, all of those years, might be slipping away before my eyes. I thought of her husband, the man she had chosen, the man I had welcomed like a son, and the unease she had once shared about his recklessness, and I cursed myself for dismissing her concerns, for saying things would get better, for wanting to believe that time would smooth away flaws that were carved too deep. Now every mile closer to Florida was a mile closer to the truth I feared, and the seat beneath me felt like a prison. I could see her face in my mind, pale and weary, eyes begging me for the help only a father could give. And yet beside her, I could see another image. Her husband raising a glass, laughing on a beach, music blaring while she struggled alone. The contrast burned me from the inside, and I clenched my hands until my nails bit into my palms. I whispered prayers under my breath, words I had not spoken in years, bargaining with a God I had long stopped talking to, promising that if He let me hold her again, I would not waste another second. Every sound of that plane was amplified, the whir of the engines, the chatter of strangers, the call of the attendants, but none of it pierced the storm in my chest. I stared out the window and saw only darkness, the kind of darkness that does not end with dawn, and I thought of her as a little girl running through the yard, her laughter like bells, her hair catching the light, and I thought of how much had been stolen from her by the very man who had vowed to protect her. When we landed, I knew the story had only begun, but the weight of what was waiting for me in Florida was heavier than any baggage I had ever carried, and as I stepped into that humid night air, I felt my soul prepare for the fight of its life. It was late at night when the call came, The kind of call that splits a life into a before and an after, and even now when I close my eyes I can still hear the tremble in the voice on the other end of the line, a voice heavy with fear and urgency, a voice that told me something was terribly wrong with my daughter and that I needed to come quickly because time was slipping away. I remember the way the phone felt in my hand, cold and heavy, as if it carried the weight of destiny itself, and for a long second I sat frozen in my chair, unable to breathe, staring at the wall in front of me while the world around me seemed to fade into silence. My daughter's friend was the one who called, a kind soul who had checked on her when the silence from her house grew too long, and the words she spoke shattered the fragile peace of my evening, telling me that my girl was weak, that she looked pale and lifeless, and that her husband was nowhere to be found. In that moment my heart thundered against my ribs, and I felt the years roll back as if I were once again the younger man clutching a child in my arms, desperate to shield her from the cruelty of the world. I asked question after question, trying to piece together what had happened, my voice quaking with fear, and though the answers came, none of them gave me the comfort I longed for, only more dread as I imagined my daughter alone, neglected and clinging to life. I remember my hands shaking as I reached for my travel bag, stuffing it with what little I thought I might need, barely able to think straight as the clock ticked louder and louder on the wall, each second like a hammer driving home the urgency. I thought of all the calls I had received in my life, good news and bad, but never one like this, never one that reached into my chest and tore apart every layer of calm I had ever built. Her friend begged me to hurry, said she could not reach the husband, and that it was clear he had been gone for days, leaving her to suffer in silence. And as those words sank in, I felt a rage bloom inside me, a rage that twisted with fear until it became something unbearable. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark for a brief moment, the weight of the decision before me pressing down like a stone. And then I rose, because there was no other choice, no hesitation, only the primal pull of a father running to save his child. I booked the ticket with trembling fingers, hearing my own breath loud in the stillness of the house, and every click of the keyboard felt like a heartbeat. Every confirmation on the screen, a reminder that this was real and not some nightmare I could wake from. I stared at her photograph on the wall as I prepared to leave. The one from her graduation, where she wore her cap and gown and her smile seemed to stretch across the whole world, and I whispered to her picture that I was coming, that nothing would stop me, that she would not be left alone again. I thought about how quickly life can change, how one ring of the phone can turn an ordinary night into the beginning of a storm that no one is prepared for, and I realized that all my years of struggle and sacrifice had been leading to this, the moment where I would have to rise once more for her sake. The house felt strange as I left, each step echoing like a farewell. And as I locked the door behind me, I could not shake the feeling that the man who returned after this journey would not be the same as the one who had left. I walked into the night, carrying with me not just a bag and a ticket, but the heavy burden of fear, love, and unspoken prayers. And I knew that whatever awaited me in Florida, it would test me in ways I had never been tested before. The flight to Florida was the longest journey of my life, though the clock insisted it was only a few hours, and as I sat there pressed against the small window of the airplane, I felt each second crawl across my skin like a burden I could not shake, and fear sat heavy in my chest, making it hard to breathe. I clutched the armrest until my knuckles burned white, and I could hear my heart thundering louder than the engines. Every beat a reminder that I was racing against time, racing against whatever darkness had already wrapped itself around my daughter. I tried to close my eyes and rest, but the images that filled my mind would not let me. Visions of her lying alone in a silent room, her body frail, her breath shallow, and beside her an empty chair where her husband should have been, replaced instead by the echo of his laughter somewhere far away among crowds and drinks and music. I thought about how many sacrifices had carried me to this moment. The years of double shifts, the calloused hands, the endless nights of worry when she was young and fragile. All of it meant to build her a future where she could be safe. And yet here I was, hurtling through the sky, wondering if I was already too late. The cabin lights dimmed and people around me whispered to each other or slipped into sleep, but I sat stiff and silent, staring out at the blackness beyond the glass, whispering words to myself that no one else could hear. I told myself that she would be all right, that I would reach her in time, but in the same breath I wondered how many fathers had said the same thing before walking into tragedies they could never undo. The memories came in waves, each one cutting deeper than the last. Her little hand gripping mine on her first day of school, her laughter ringing in my ears as she ran through sprinklers in the summer. The tears in her eyes when she told me about the man she loved and wanted to marry, the man I had once shaken hands with and welcomed into my family without knowing how much pain he would one day cause. I thought about the call again and again, the fear in her friend's voice, the urgency, the unspoken truth that if I did not move faster, I might never see my daughter alive again. My stomach twisted with dread, and every announcement from the captain felt like a delay carved into stone, each mile closer, not close enough. I tapped my foot against the floor, restless, unable to find peace, and in the rhythm of that tapping I remembered the nights I had stayed up waiting for her to come home from college, pacing the house with worry, until I heard the door open and saw her safe. How strange that now the roles had shifted, that she was the one waiting for me, though perhaps not even conscious enough to know I was on my way. I whispered prayers under my breath, bargains with a God I had neglected for too long, asking for just one more chance to hold her hand, to tell her she was not alone, to remind her that her father had not forgotten her. The engines roared as the plane cut through clouds, and I thought of my wife, gone so many years, and how she would have wept to see her daughter in this state, how she would have demanded answers from a son-in-law who thought the world owed him its pleasures, while his wife wasted away. I clenched my teeth and swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat, telling myself that anger could wait, that survival had to come first, that when I reached Florida there would be time for fury, but not on this flight. The hours dragged and I tried to distract myself by counting the breaths I took, by tracing the pattern of the seat in front of me, but nothing could silence the pounding thought that every second I sat in that plane was a second my daughter spent in danger. When the wheels finally touched down, I felt no relief, only a surge of determination, because the flight of fear had only carried me to the beginning of what I knew would be the hardest fight of my life. As the plane rolled across the runway, and I prepared myself for what awaited me, I could not stop the flood of memories that rose within me and carried me back to the beginning, to the years when my daughter was just a little girl, and I was a younger man, trying to find my way through a life that had shattered when her mother passed away, leaving me to raise her alone with nothing but my will and my love to guide me. I remembered the nights when I came home bone-tired from working 2 jobs, my clothes smelling of sweat and metal from the factory or of grease from the diner where I washed dishes until my fingers ached. And yet, when I opened the door and heard her tiny voice call out "Daddy," I found the strength to smile and lift her into my arms, because I knew she needed me to be strong even when I wanted nothing more than to collapse. I thought of the mornings when I packed her school lunches while the sky was still dark, slipping notes into her bag that said, "I love you," or "Be brave today," because I wanted her to know that no matter what the world threw at her, her father believed in her. There were winters when I could not afford heat, and I bundled her in blankets, sitting beside her on the floor with a single space heater buzzing between us, telling her stories about her mother, so that she would not forget the woman who had given her life and the love that had once filled our home. There were summers when I saved every penny to buy her a cheap second-hand bicycle, watching her pedal down the cracked sidewalks with laughter spilling out of her mouth like sunshine, and I told myself that even if the world had taken her mother, it would not take her joy. I remembered the years when I paid every bill late because I wanted to save enough to send her to college, the envelopes stacking up on the table while I skipped meals to make sure she had books, clothes, and a chance at a future better than mine. And though my body wore down and my hair turned gray earlier than it should have, I never regretted a single sacrifice because each one was for her. I thought of the day she graduated, the way she stood on that stage with her diploma in hand, her eyes searching the crowd until they found mine, and I wept openly because I had kept my promise. I had carried her to that milestone even when it felt impossible. I remembered helping her pack when she moved away, carrying box after box to the car, my heart heavy with the knowledge that I was letting her step into a world where I could not always protect her, yet filled with pride that she had the courage to begin a life of her own. When she called me to tell me she was in love, I smiled, though a small part of me worried, because every father fears the day another man becomes the center of his daughter's life. But I told her I trusted her judgment, and I welcomed him into our family with open arms, hoping he would honor her as I had. Now, as I sat in that plane, I realized that every memory of sacrifice was not just the past, but the foundation of why I was there, why I had dropped everything and rushed to Florida, because all those years had built a bond that nothing could break. I had been there for her first steps, her first words, her first heartbreak. And I would be there for this moment too, no matter how dark or painful it turned out to be. My sacrifices were not burdens. They were the story of our lives together, and they gave me the strength to face what was waiting on the other side of this journey. I whispered into the stillness of the cabin that I was coming for her, that her father had never stopped fighting for her, and as the memories swirled in my mind, I held on to them like a shield against the fear that threatened to consume me. When I think back now, I realize the first warning signs were there long before the phone call that changed everything, and it pains me to admit that I ignored them because I wanted so badly to believe that my daughter's happiness was secure, that the man she had chosen would grow into the role of a husband worthy of her devotion. But hindsight is a cruel teacher, and it reveals every flaw in the choices we made. I remember the first time she called me sounding tired, her voice carrying that edge of frustration as she said he had been out late again, drinking with friends while she sat at home waiting. And I told her not to worry, that every marriage had its adjustments, that in time he would settle down. And I thought I was giving her comfort, but what I was really doing was brushing aside her pain. She told me once that he had forgotten her birthday, arriving home hours after midnight with the smell of alcohol heavy on his breath, and though I wanted to drive down right then and set him straight, I told myself it was just a mistake, that love would smooth it over. I remember the day she confided that she felt alone even when he was beside her, that he had a way of making her feel like a shadow in her own home. And instead of telling her to walk away, I encouraged patience because I believed that marriage required endurance and compromise. And perhaps because I did not want to face the possibility that my daughter had tied her future to a man unworthy of her. There were moments when I visited and noticed the house untidy. Dishes left piled up, her eyes ringed with exhaustion, and I asked where he was only for her to say he was out again, working late or with friends. And though my heart clenched, I let it pass with a nod, telling myself young men had energy to burn and that I had no right to interfere. One night she called me in tears, saying he had laughed when she asked him to spend more time with her, that he told her she was too needy, and I can still hear her voice breaking as she asked me if she was asking for too much, and I told her no. Of course not. But I softened my words with excuses for him, saying he was probably stressed, that work could make a man careless with words. I see now that each of these moments was a warning, each one a red flag waving before my eyes, and I chose to look past them because I wanted to believe in the life she had built. I wanted to believe she would not be forced to endure loneliness inside a marriage meant to be her safe harbor. A father's heart can be both strong and blind, strong enough to carry the burdens of love but blind to the shadows forming around it. And I know now that my blindness cost her more than I will ever forgive myself for. I remember the day she mentioned quietly that he spent more money on nights out than he ever gave her for the household, that she sometimes skipped meals so the bills would be paid. And my anger flared then, but I buried it beneath a smile, telling her I would send her some extra money, telling myself that supporting her quietly was enough. The truth is, I was afraid of pushing her away, afraid that if I spoke too harshly about the man she loved, she might choose him over me. And so I swallowed my doubts and wrapped them in silence. Looking back, I see that silence was my greatest mistake, because silence gives space for neglect to grow, and every moment I chose to remain quiet was another brick in the wall that kept her trapped. I thought love would teach him responsibility, that in time he would realize the treasure he had in her, but instead love became the excuse he used to take her for granted. Those first warning signs were not whispers, they were cries I should have heeded. But I closed my ears and convinced myself that all would be well, and by the time I saw the truth it was nearly too late. When the plane finally touched down in Florida and the seatbelt sign chimed, I felt a surge of urgency rush through me, and I pushed past the numbness that had held me captive throughout the flight, because I knew every step forward was one closer to my daughter, and one closer to the truth that I both dreaded and demanded. The air outside was thick and heavy with the weight of the coastal humidity, and as I walked through the airport with my small bag clutched tightly in my hand, I could feel the sweat already forming on my brow, though I hardly noticed because my mind was racing too fast. I had not been to Florida in years, and the brightness of the place felt wrong against the darkness of my mood, families laughing as they waited for their luggage, couples holding hands, children running ahead of tired parents, all of them living in a world of ease while I carried the crushing fear that my child was fighting for her life. I found a taxi and climbed in, the driver chatting idly about the weather, the traffic, and the influx of tourists, his words falling against me like meaningless noise, and all I could do was stare out the window at streets I barely saw. The drive felt endless, every stoplight mocking me, every turn dragging me further into a haze of dread, and I gripped the seat so tightly my fingers ached. When we pulled up to her neighborhood, I saw the houses lined neatly, with manicured lawns and palm trees swaying in the breeze. But as we turned onto her street, something inside me tightened, because her home did not look like the others. The grass was overgrown, the paint on the porch chipped, the blinds drawn as though the house itself wanted to hide from the world, and as I stepped out of the car, the silence pressed against me like a suffocating blanket. I walked up the path slowly, my eyes darting across the yard, noticing the litter of unopened mail near the front step, the faint smell of trash wafting from somewhere unseen, and I felt a cold chill despite the Florida heat, because I knew neglect when I saw it. I knocked on the door and waited, my heart hammering, but no answer came, only the echo of my own fist against the wood. I knocked again louder, calling her name, straining for any sound, and when the silence continued, I fumbled for the spare key she had once given me years ago, praying it would still work. The lock clicked and I pushed the door open, the air inside stale and heavy, carrying with it the scent of dust, spoiled food, and something faintly sour that made my stomach turn. The living room was cluttered, dishes stacked on the coffee table, clothes draped over chairs, and the television dark as though it had not been touched in days. The silence was thick and unnatural. No music, no laughter, not even the hum of a fan, just the hollow stillness of a place forgotten. I called out again, my voice trembling, and the sound of it seemed too loud, too harsh against the emptiness. I walked through the house slowly, each step echoing in my ears, my eyes searching for some sign of her, my heart thudding painfully as I reached the hallway. The walls seemed to close in, the air heavier with every step, and I felt dread clawing at me because I knew that whatever I found would change everything. I paused at her bedroom door, my hand trembling on the knob, and in that brief moment I thought of all the nights I had kissed her good night, tucked her in, told her stories until her eyes closed, and now here I was, an old man standing on the edge of another story, one that felt more like a nightmare. I pushed the door open, and the sight that met me was one I will never forget for as long as I live. When the door to her bedroom swung open, and the dim light from the hallway spilled across the room, my breath caught in my throat because what I saw was not the daughter I had raised, not the bright girl who once filled my life with laughter and warmth, but a fragile shadow of her lying motionless on the bed. Her skin pale as porcelain, her lips cracked and dry, her hair tangled across the pillow as though it had not been brushed in days, and the sound that reached me was not a greeting or even a cry, but the faint, ragged gasp of someone fighting just to hold on to another moment. I stumbled forward, my knees weak beneath me, and I whispered her name, though my voice broke halfway through, and her eyes fluttered open just barely, glazed and heavy, struggling to focus on me. And in that moment I felt a wave of helplessness so deep it nearly drowned me, because I realized she had been left here in this state, without care, without company, without the love and attention every human deserves, abandoned in her most vulnerable hour. I dropped my bag to the floor and rushed to her side, taking her frail hand in mine, feeling how cold her skin was, how thin her fingers felt compared to the child I once held, who clung to me with strength and joy. I tried to speak, to tell her I was there now, that her father had come, but the words caught in my throat as tears blurred my vision, and all I could do was squeeze her hand and pray that she could feel my presence, even if she could not understand my words. I looked around the room, and what I saw filled me with both sorrow and rage. The empty bottles on the nightstand, the plates crusted with food long spoiled, the curtains drawn tight so no light could reach her, and I knew then that this was not sudden, this was not some illness that struck without warning, this was neglect, days of abandonment that had worn her down until she was a whisper of herself. I could hear her breathing, shallow and uneven, each inhale a battle, each exhale a victory, and I felt panic claw at me, because I did not know how long she had been like this, or how close she was to slipping away entirely. I spoke to her softly, telling her stories from when she was a girl, reminding her of the time we went fishing at the lake, and she laughed when the fish slipped from my hands, reminding her of the birthday when I baked a cake that sank in the middle and she pretended it was perfect, reminding her that she had always been stronger than she knew, that her father had never doubted her, even when the world did. Her eyes flickered as if she recognized the words, as if deep inside she was still fighting, and I held on to that flicker like a drowning man clutching driftwood. My chest ached as I thought of the man who had promised to love her, who should have been here at her side, but who instead was out in the night somewhere, chasing pleasure and ignoring the vow he had made. And though anger burned in me, I pushed it aside, because in that moment only she mattered. I brushed her hair back from her forehead, my hand trembling, and whispered that I would not leave her, not now, not ever, that she was not alone, and though she could not answer, a faint tear slid from the corner of her eye, and I knew she had heard me. The silence of the house pressed against us, broken only by her strained breaths and the pounding of my own heart, and I realized with a clarity that cut like glass that this was the moment where everything changed, that my journey had not been about simply arriving, but about finding her in this state, fragile, abandoned, yet still alive, and that as long as she lived, there was still something I could do. My hands trembled as I reached for the phone on the nightstand, fumbling with it as though I had never held one before, my fingers clumsy with panic, because every second mattered, and I knew that if I failed now, I might lose her forever, and the thought alone was enough to make my chest seize with terror. I dialed for help, my voice breaking as I tried to explain to the operator that my daughter was barely breathing, that she was pale and cold, that I needed someone to come immediately, and though they assured me an ambulance was on the way, the minutes that followed felt like an eternity carved into stone. I knelt beside her bed, pressing her hand between mine, whispering over and over that she was going to be all right, that her father was here now, that she was not alone, and yet I could not shake the fear that my words might be the last she would ever hear. I could see the rise and fall of her chest, shallow and weak, and I counted each breath like it was the most precious thing in the world, begging silently for one more and then another, bargaining with a God I had ignored for too long, promising everything I had left if only he would give her strength. My tears blurred my sight, and I wiped them away angrily, because I wanted her to see my face clearly, to see determination instead of despair, but inside I was unraveling, the desperation clawing at my heart until I thought it might burst. I rushed to the bathroom, soaking a cloth in cool water, and returned to lay it across her forehead, trying to bring her some comfort, trying to give her body some relief, though it felt pitiful against the enormity of what she needed. I searched the room for anything, medicine bottles, signs of what had led her here, and found nothing but emptiness and neglect. And the rage inside me grew darker with every second as I thought of the man who should have been here and was not. I shouted her name, not in anger but in the desperate hope that she would wake, that she would fight, that somewhere inside her she could hear her father calling her back, and for a fleeting moment her eyelids fluttered and her lips parted, as though she wanted to speak, but no sound came. I held her tighter, telling her that she could not leave me, not like this, that I had not carried her through all those years only to lose her, in a silence created by someone else's carelessness. The house felt like it was collapsing in on me, the silence pressing down, the air thick with the smell of sickness, and I prayed to hear the siren of salvation outside the door. I rocked her gently, as though she were once again the little girl who cried in the night, and I told her the same words I had told her then, that Daddy was here, that everything would be all right, even though I was not sure I believed them myself. My desperation grew sharper with every tick of the clock, and I could not stop pacing the room, rushing to the window to peer out, then back to her side, torn between the urge to scream into the night and the need to hold her close. I thought of every moment we had shared, every sacrifice I had made, and I told myself that none of it could end here, not in this room, not like this, and I swore aloud that I would fight for her with everything I had. When at last I heard the faint wail of sirens in the distance, my knees nearly gave way, relief and fear colliding, because though help was coming, I knew the battle was not yet won. And as I looked down at her fragile body, I whispered one final plea, asking her to hold on just a little longer, because her father was not ready to let go. As I waited for the sound of the ambulance to draw closer and prayed for it to arrive in time, I found myself slipping into memories of her childhood, because the mind of an old man clings to the past when the present feels unbearable, and those memories flooded me like a tide, pulling me back to days when my daughter was small and the world was still filled with innocence and hope. I could see her as a toddler running barefoot across the grass in our backyard, her laughter rising higher than the song of the birds, her arms outstretched as if she wanted to catch the sunlight itself, and I remembered how her mother and I would sit together watching her, believing that her future would be filled with nothing but joy. I remembered the way she would cling to my leg when she was shy, burying her face against me whenever strangers came to visit, and how I would gently lift her into my arms and tell her that she had nothing to fear because her father would always protect her. After her mother passed, those moments became even more sacred because I knew I had to be both parents to her. I had to carry her pain while hiding my own. And there were nights when I sat by her bed long after she had fallen asleep, brushing the hair from her forehead, whispering promises to the dark that I would never let the world break her spirit. I remembered the school mornings when I tied her shoes with fingers that trembled from exhaustion after long shifts. But I smiled because the sight of her ready for the day filled me with pride. And when she waved goodbye from the steps of the school bus, I felt as though I was sending a piece of my heart out into the world. I thought of her birthdays, the cakes I tried to bake that never came out quite right, the decorations I hung clumsily around the small kitchen, and yet the joy on her face made me feel like the richest man alive. I remembered teaching her how to ride a bicycle, running beside her down the cracked sidewalk until she found her balance, and the way she looked back at me with triumph in her eyes, shouting, "Daddy, I did it," and I shouted back that I always knew she could. I remembered the Christmas mornings when she would leap from bed before dawn, racing to the small tree we decorated with hand-me-down ornaments, her eyes shining brighter than the lights. And even when there were only a few modest gifts, her gratitude made each one feel like treasure. I thought of the times when she was sick with fever, and I sat beside her bed wiping her brow with a cool cloth, singing songs her mother used to sing, watching her eyelids grow heavy as she drifted into sleep. And I swore to myself then that I would always be there to keep her safe. I remembered her teenage years, the arguments that came when she wanted independence, and I feared the dangers outside, the slammed doors and the silence at dinner, but also the moments of reconciliation when she came to me in tears and I held her until her anger faded, both of us learning how to love each other through the storms. I remembered the day she graduated high school, how she looked in her cap and gown, how my chest swelled with pride as she crossed the stage, and I thought of her mother again, how she would have been so proud to see the girl we had raised standing tall. All of those memories swirled inside me as I held her hand in that darkened room, memories of the little girl who had once depended on me for everything. And I realized with crushing weight that nothing had changed because even now she needed me more than ever. The sirens were growing louder, hope drawing closer, but I clung to the past in those final moments of waiting, letting the memories remind me why I could not fail. why I had to fight with every breath left in me, to make sure that the little girl who once laughed in the sunshine would not be lost to the shadows of neglect. As the ambulance carried my daughter away, and I sat in the back clutching her frail hand, listening to the machine's beep and the medics murmur words I barely understood, I learned the truth of where her husband had been. And that truth struck me harder than any blow I had ever taken in my long life. Because while she lay at death's door, he was not at her side praying, not rushing through the night to save her, but at a beachside party surrounded by music and laughter, drinking with friends as if the world owed him joy, while his wife's life slipped away unnoticed. One of the neighbors had told me in a low voice as I rushed to gather what little belongings she needed, shaking her head in disgust as she said she had seen him leave the house 2 nights earlier with a bottle in his hand, not returning even once, and later she heard from others that he was spotted on the sand, shirt open, shouting with laughter, dancing with strangers as though he had no ties or responsibilities. I sat there in the dim light of the ambulance, and the betrayal cut through me like a jagged blade, because this was not just neglect, it was abandonment, and worse, it was done with a smile, while the woman he had vowed to protect and cherish lay forgotten. I thought of the wedding day, how my daughter had looked at him with eyes full of hope, how she had taken his hand and promised her life to him, and how I had forced myself to believe that he would be the one to stand beside her through every storm. I remembered shaking his hand, looking him in the eye, welcoming him into the family with the trust of a man who had sacrificed everything for his child, and I could not reconcile that memory with the image of him now, dancing under the stars with strangers while his wife fought for breath. My heart ached with anger and sorrow tangled together, and I found myself clenching my fists until my nails dug into my palms, wanting to shout, wanting to strike, but knowing that my daughter needed every ounce of my strength focused on her survival, not wasted on rage. Yet even as I tried to keep calm, the betrayal seared into me, because it was not only a betrayal of my daughter but of me as well, of the trust I had given, of the family I had opened to him, of the countless times I had chosen to believe in his better nature despite the warning signs I had seen. I thought of how many nights she had called me in tears, how many times she had confessed her loneliness, and I realized now that while she cried for the love she longed for, he was busy finding joy elsewhere, filling his nights with noise and strangers, while she withered in silence. I felt shame, too. Shame that I had told her to endure, that I had said things might improve, that I had placed my faith in a man unworthy of it, and now I was forced to see the consequences of that choice lying weak beside me. The medic spoke quickly, asking questions, adjusting tubes, and I answered as best as I could, my voice breaking. But in the back of my mind, I could not stop hearing the laughter that must have spilled from his mouth while she struggled alone. The betrayal was not just in his absence, it was in his indifference, in the way he had chosen pleasure over responsibility, in the way he had abandoned vows as if they were nothing more than words spoken on a single day. I looked at my daughter's face, pale and still, and I swore to myself then that this would not be forgotten, that the truth of his betrayal would not be buried under excuses or lies, that one day he would be forced to face what he had done. As the ambulance pulled into the hospital and the doors swung open, I felt the weight of both fear and fury pressing down on me. But above it all, I felt the resolve of a father who would not allow his daughter's suffering to go unanswered. As I sat in the hospital waiting room, with my hands clasped so tightly together that my knuckles throbbed, I could feel the anger beginning to build inside me like a storm, gathering strength on the horizon. And though fear for my daughter's life remained at the center of my thoughts, there was another fire taking root, A fire that grew hotter each time I remembered the sight of her fragile body lying alone and the knowledge that her husband had been laughing and drinking while she suffered. I thought of every moment I had once welcomed him into our family, every dinner at my table where I offered him food and conversation, every time I handed him advice or money when he claimed to need help, and the memories now felt poisoned because the man I had treated like a son had betrayed not only my daughter, but also the trust I had so freely given. I remembered her voice in the past, telling me she felt unseen, unheard, and I had told her to be patient, that he was young and would learn, and now my patience mocked me, because it had bought him time to neglect her even further. I could feel my heart pounding harder with each recollection, each broken promise. Each night he had chosen pleasure over responsibility, and I clenched my jaw so tightly it ached as I stared at the sterile white walls around me. I remembered the first time he came to me, asking for help with money to fix his car, and how I handed over what little I had saved without hesitation because I wanted to believe he was a man trying to build a stable life. But now, I saw those moments for what they were. Opportunities wasted on someone who valued nothing but himself. My daughter lay behind those closed doors, hooked to machines, her life hanging by a thread, and I could not stop imagining him at that very moment, perhaps still drunk, perhaps still laughing, while I sat in agony. The anger grew heavier each time a doctor or nurse passed me without news, each minute of waiting feeling like a test of how much a father's heart could endure before it shattered. I thought of my wife, how she would have looked at me now with eyes filled with sorrow, how she would have urged me to remain calm. But even she would not have been able to stop the fire in me from spreading, because I knew in my bones that no man who truly loved his wife could have abandoned her in this way. My thoughts spiraled to the day he married her, how he stood before friends and family, how he smiled when he made vows to cherish and protect. And I wanted to shout into the night that those vows had been lies, hollow words spoken to gain trust and nothing more. The rage burned deeper when I recalled how I had once defended him to others, how I told myself and those around me that he was simply adjusting, that he would grow into his role. And now all those defenses tasted like ash in my mouth. I felt betrayed not only by him, but by my own hope, by the way I had silenced my doubts to protect her happiness, by the way I had ignored the warning signs, and that realization only made the anger hotter because I knew I should have acted sooner. As I sat there in the hard chair of that hospital hallway, I could feel my fists clenching and unclenching, my body trembling with the effort to contain what was rising inside me, because though I wanted to storm out and find him, to drag him here and force him to see what he had done, I also knew that the only thing that mattered in that moment was her survival. Still, the fire could not be extinguished, and I swore to myself that when she was safe, when she had regained her strength, I would no longer stand silently by. I would no longer allow my anger to remain contained within me, because the betrayal had planted something deep in my soul, and I could already feel it shaping into the resolve to act. I sat by her bedside in the hospital, and the hours stretched into something endless. The steady beeping of machines, marking time in a way that felt cruel. Each sound, a reminder that my daughter's life depended not on her own strength alone, but on wires, tubes, and the hands of strangers in white coats. And though the doctors did their best to explain her condition to me, their words blurred together into a haze of medical terms that my old ears struggled to follow until one phrase broke through with clarity: that she had been left neglected for days, and that the neglect had worsened her state until she was now in critical danger. Those words sank into me like lead, each syllable another weight pressing down on my chest. and I sat there gripping her hand while the doctor's voice faded into the background, my mind replaying the countless times I had worked myself to exhaustion so that she could have food, warmth, and opportunity. And now, all of that love and sacrifice seemed to have been undone by the careless cruelty of a man who could not even stay by her side in her time of need. The nurses moved quietly around us, adjusting her IV, checking her monitors, whispering updates I barely heard, and I could not take my eyes from her pale face, her closed eyelids trembling faintly, as though she was caught in some distant dream. And I begged silently that she was dreaming of brighter days rather than trapped in the nightmare that reality had become. I thought of when she was a little girl sick with the flu, lying on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her, how I would sit at her side, spooning soup into her mouth, reading stories until she drifted off to sleep, and I wondered how anyone could look at her suffering and not feel compelled to do the same, how anyone who claimed to love her could have chosen a bottle and a party over this sacred duty. The vigil became my world, the walls of the hospital room closing in until there was nothing left but me, her, and the faint hum of machines, and I poured my heart into the silence, telling her softly that I was here, that she was not alone, that she had fought too hard in life to give up now, and though she gave no response, I held on to the belief that somewhere in the quiet she could hear me. The doctors returned with updates, explaining that her body was weak from dehydration and lack of nourishment, that her illness had been left untreated too long, and I could see the pity in their eyes when they looked at me. The old man who had carried his daughter into their care when it should have been her husband standing here. Their pity was like salt in an open wound, but I did not push it away because I knew they were right. And every glance reminded me of the betrayal I could never forgive. I stayed through the night, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, my own body weary but unwilling to rest, because to rest would mean letting go of her hand, and I could not bear to loosen my grip even for a moment. I whispered prayers I had not prayed in years, asking for strength, asking for a miracle, asking for just one more chance to see her smile again, and though the night was long and dark, I clung to the sound of her breath as proof that she was still here, still fighting. When dawn finally crept through the blinds, I saw her face bathed in pale light, fragile yet still alive, and I knew that my vigil was far from over, that this was only the beginning of a battle that would demand everything I had left to give. As I sat in that hospital room, listening to the steady hum of machines and watching my daughter fight for life, I could not stop the memory of cruel words I had once overheard from her husband, words that returned to me now, with sharper edges, slicing through whatever patience or forgiveness I might have carried. It had been months earlier during a visit when I came by unexpectedly carrying groceries because I knew money was tight, and as I walked up the steps I heard his voice inside, harsh and dismissive, telling her that she was too much of a burden, that she complained too much, that she held him back from living the life he deserved. I froze on the porch, my heart thundering, my hand tightening around the bag of food I carried. And though every part of me wanted to storm in and confront him, I hesitated because I did not want to shame her or make her feel smaller by overhearing her pain. Instead, I stayed silent, listening as his words poured out, calling her weak, telling her she needed to toughen up, accusing her of being nothing more than a weight around his neck. I heard her voice tremble in response, soft and pleading, telling him that she only wanted his love, that she only needed his presence, and the sound of her trying to defend her worth shattered something inside me, because I knew she had more strength and more value than he could ever comprehend. I stepped back then, retreating to my car, telling myself I would talk to her later, that I would not humiliate her in the moment. But I never told her what I heard, and now those words echoed in my mind like poison, each syllable cutting into me as I sat beside her hospital bed. I remembered how she smiled when she saw me come in later that day, trying to hide the redness around her eyes, brushing off my questions with excuses, and I let her hide because I wanted to believe she was still holding on to some sense of dignity in her marriage. The cruel words came back to me now louder than ever, and I could see how they had carved into her spirit long before her body broke down. Neglect is not always measured in what is withheld physically, but in the way words can wound, in the way love can be twisted into cruelty, and I realized that while I had feared his absence, his presence had been just as damaging. I clenched her hand tighter, whispering to her that she was not a burden, that she never had been, that from the day she was born she had been the greatest gift of my life, and tears streamed down my face as I spoke, because I wanted her to hear the truth above the lies he had once thrown at her. I told her of the nights when she was a child and I stayed up after long shifts just to watch her breathe, of the pride I felt every time she succeeded, of the joy she brought me in even the smallest moments, and I told her that no man, no cruel voice, no betrayal could erase that truth. The cruel words had haunted me because I had kept them locked inside, afraid to wound her more by repeating them. But now I spoke my truth aloud in defiance, letting her know that she had never been a weight, never been a chain, but rather the reason I endured every hardship. I remembered how her husband had laughed as he said those words, the callous tone that suggested he truly believed them, and that memory fanned the flames of my anger until it burned steady inside me. No longer just a passing emotion, but a vow that those words would not be the last to define her. As I sat in that sterile room with the smell of disinfectant heavy in the air, I leaned close to her and promised that she would never again be silenced by cruelty, that the lies she had heard would be drowned out by truth, and though her eyes remained closed, I swore I saw the faintest flicker of movement in her lips, as if somewhere deep within she was still fighting to reject the poison of his voice. There comes a moment in every man's life when patience is no longer a virtue, but a chain that keeps him bound, and as I sat there in the hospital room, watching the faint rise and fall of my daughter's chest, listening to the whispers of doctors who spoke of how long she had gone without proper care, I felt something inside me snap, a breaking point where sorrow gave way to determination so fierce it frightened even me. I had spent days drowning in memories, nights replaying my sacrifices, hours begging for miracles. But as the reality of her suffering settled deeper into my bones, I knew that if she survived this ordeal, I would never allow her to return to the cruelty that had brought her here. I thought of her husband, drunk and careless at his parties, living as though vows meant nothing, and I told myself with absolute certainty that I would not let her go back to him, not while I drew breath. It was no longer enough to hope, no longer enough to believe that love could change him or that time would teach him responsibility, because he had already proven that he was capable of abandoning her when she needed him most, and that kind of betrayal could not be undone by apologies or promises. I whispered to her as she slept that her father had reached his breaking point, that I would not stay silent anymore, that the days of standing on the sidelines while she carried pain in her heart were over, and though she could not answer, I felt as though she heard me in some distant way. The breaking point came with a clarity I had never felt before, a sudden vision of the future where she was safe, cared for, and free of his cruelty. And I clung to that vision like a lifeline, repeating to myself that I would make it real, no matter the cost. I thought of all the times I had bitten my tongue, all the excuses I had made for him, all the reassurances I had given her when she confessed her loneliness, and shame burned through me. But I transformed that shame into resolve, swearing that I would not fail her again. I imagined what her mother would say if she were here, how she would not tolerate seeing her daughter diminished and neglected, how she would demand justice, and I knew I had to be her voice as well as my own. The doctors told me recovery would be slow if she made it through, that her body had been pushed to the edge, and those words steeled me further because it meant she would need protection and support more than ever, and I was ready to give everything I had left. My breaking point was not loud, not a shout or a violent act, but a quiet certainty that rooted itself in my soul, a vow that if she opened her eyes again, she would open them to a world where her father would shield her from harm, where no cruel words or reckless neglect would ever touch her again. I sat there, through the long hours of the night, holding her hand, whispering the truth into the silence, reminding her that she was loved, that she was worthy, that she was not alone, and with every word I spoke, I felt my resolve harden. I realized that this was the moment my life had been moving toward, that every sacrifice, every struggle, every memory of raising her alone had prepared me for this breaking point where I had to rise not just as her father, but as her defender. When I finally stood and looked at her frail body lying under the harsh lights, I swore aloud that if she survived, I would fight with every ounce of strength left in me to ensure she never again felt the pain of betrayal. And that vow became the heartbeat that carried me into the next chapter of this battle. The confrontation began, not with shouting, but with the heavy silence that fell across the hospital room when the door opened and he finally appeared, reeking of alcohol, his shirt untucked, his eyes glassy, with the remnants of another night, spent drowning in bottles and laughter, while his wife lay tethered to machines. And I felt the fury inside me burn hotter than it ever had before. Though on the surface, I forced myself into calm because I wanted him to see in my eyes the storm that was coming for him. He stumbled slightly as he entered, glancing at her with what seemed more annoyance than concern, and then he had the audacity to look at me as though I were the intruder, as though my presence beside her bed was an offense, and in that instant my patience ended. I rose slowly from my chair, my knees stiff with age but my spirit strong with purpose, and I stood between him and my daughter, blocking his path so that he could not come near her without facing me. He muttered something under his breath, a half-slurred complaint about how he had things under control, and I stared at him in disbelief, wondering how a man could twist neglect into confidence, how he could stand in the same room as the woman he had abandoned and act as though he still had authority over her care. The doctors had already told me how long she had been left without food or medicine, how her condition had worsened because she had been alone. And now here he was, smelling of cheap liquor and salt air, carrying with him the stench of betrayal, and I felt the weight of every sacrifice I had made for her, pressing against me, fueling the fire that demanded justice. I wanted to strike him, to unleash the rage that had built through sleepless nights and hours of waiting, but I held myself steady because I knew that violence would give him an excuse, and I did not want excuses, I wanted truth. So I looked him in the eye and told him plainly that he had failed her, that while she fought for her life, he had chosen pleasure, and I saw the smirk falter on his face, though he quickly tried to recover, brushing me off with a shrug as though I were exaggerating. That shrug nearly broke me, the casual dismissal of a man who did not care that his wife was lying pale and broken beside him, and I leaned closer so that he could not mistake my words. telling him that from this moment forward he would answer not just to her but to me, and that I would not rest until every person he knew, every friend, every family member, every authority understood what he had done. He scoffed, muttering something about how she was dramatic, about how she had always exaggerated, and in that moment I realized that he had convinced himself of his own lies, that he truly believed he could walk away from his neglect without consequence. But I was no longer the man who stayed silent. I was the father who had reached his breaking point and now stood in the fire of confrontation. The nurses entered, glancing at the tension in the room, but I kept my voice low and steady, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose control, and I watched as his bravado flickered beneath the weight of my gaze. The confrontation had begun, not with fists or fury, but with the immovable resolve of a father who would no longer allow cruelty to pass unnoticed. And though he tried to laugh it off, I could see the first crack forming in his confidence, the small tremor in his hand, the flicker in his eyes that revealed he knew the storm was coming. When he left the hospital room that night with the same careless swagger he had carried in, I did not follow him because my place was at her side. Yet, as I sat there, holding her hand and listening to the steady rhythm of the machines that kept her alive, I made a decision so firm it felt as though it had been carved into my very soul. And that decision was that I would no longer sit silently and hope for change. I would act with every ounce of strength and cunning I had left to ensure that he could never hurt her again. The resolve that took hold of me was not born of anger alone, though anger burned hot in my veins. It was born of love, of decades spent protecting her, of promises whispered in the dark when she was a child, crying for the mother she lost. Promises that I would always be there, that I would never let the world swallow her whole. I thought of every sacrifice I had made, the years of toil, the nights without sleep, the meals skipped so she could eat, the countless hours spent shaping her future, and I told myself that those sacrifices demanded action now, demanded that I rise once more to shield her. My resolve was quiet, but immovable. The kind of strength that comes not from youth, but from a lifetime of enduring hardship and finding ways to survive, and I felt it steady me in a way that surprised even me. I imagined the path forward, clear and deliberate, gathering the truth of what he had done, building the case piece by piece, speaking to the doctors, the nurses, the neighbors who had seen his absence, and ensuring that no corner of his neglect would remain hidden. I knew he would try to charm his way out, to twist words, to claim she had exaggerated, but my resolve was to strip away his lies and leave him standing naked in the truth. As I sat there in the dim light of the hospital room, I whispered to her that her father had made up his mind, that she would not go back to him, that I would fight for her in every way I knew how. And though she was still unconscious, I swore I felt her hand twitch faintly as if in answer. I thought of her mother, and how she had once told me that love is not only about tenderness, but about standing firm when storms come. And I realized that my love for our daughter now demanded strength sharper than steel. The father's resolve is not something easily broken, and in that room I became more than a grieving old man. I became a guardian once more, determined to use what years remained to protect the life I had once held in my arms as a baby. I planned in silence, thinking of lawyers I could call, of records I could request, of the conversations I would have with the doctors who had already told me how long she had been neglected, and I knew that with each step forward I would gather a mountain of truth too heavy for him to push aside. I promised myself I would not let my anger cloud the path, that I would move carefully, deliberately, ensuring that every action I took was one that would stand firm when questioned. My resolve was not just to protect her from him in the present, but to secure a future where she could heal without his shadow darkening her days, and I felt my back straighten with purpose, even though my body was weary. I kissed her forehead softly, and whispered again that she was not alone, that her father was here. And as the night stretched on and the machines continued their steady song, I sat in stillness, letting the fire of my resolve burn quietly but fiercely, ready for the battles that would come. The morning after my resolve had settled into me like iron, I began taking the steps I knew were necessary. Because love alone would not protect her now, I needed proof, guidance, and allies. And so I quietly sought out the professional help that could give me the strength of law and medicine to stand against the man who had betrayed her. I spoke first with the doctors who cared for her, listening as they explained in patient but grave tones how long she must have been left untreated, how the dehydration and malnourishment were not sudden but the result of days of neglect, and I asked them to write their findings clearly so there would be no mistake about the truth. They agreed because they had seen too many cases where silence allowed cruelty to hide, and their compassion gave me hope that I would not fight this battle alone. I sat with the nurses as well, kind women and men who had taken shifts at her bedside, and they told me of the condition she was in when she first arrived, how her skin was cool to the touch, how her pulse had been weak, and I saw in their eyes the same quiet outrage that lived in me. I wrote their names down carefully, determined that their testimony would one day be part of the reckoning to come. From there, I made calls to lawyers, men and women who dealt in family law, and I explained in trembling but steady words that my daughter had been left to suffer while her husband disappeared to parties. And though some gave me polite assurances without much passion, there was one who listened deeply, her voice firm as she told me that neglect could be proven, that there were avenues to ensure my daughter would never again be at his mercy. I met with her in a quiet office away from the hospital, sliding across the table the notes I had already gathered, the statements from doctors and nurses, the accounts from neighbors who had seen him gone, and as she looked through them, she nodded with the confidence of someone who knew how to fight battles in courts as well as I fought them in life. She told me we could build a case, that his absence and carelessness could be documented, that the truth could be laid bare in a way that would strip him of the power he thought he held. I listened carefully, nodding, feeling both relief and a sharpened sense of purpose, because this was no longer just my anger speaking, it was the beginning of justice. At the same time, I made sure to seek counsel from counselors and doctors who could guide her recovery, knowing that even if her body healed, the wounds left by betrayal would linger, and I wanted her to have every chance to find her strength again. The professional help became my army, each person another stone in the foundation I was building, and I felt less alone with every step. Still, I kept it all quiet, not wanting him to know how carefully I was moving, because I wanted the day of reckoning to come suddenly and leave him with no escape. At night I returned to the hospital, sitting once more by her side, whispering updates she could not yet answer, telling her about the people who were helping us, telling her that her father was no longer fighting alone. I could not know if she heard me, but I spoke anyway, because speaking kept me strong, and because I believed that even in her fragile state, some part of her could feel the strength of my determination. The days blurred together as I gathered names, documents, records, and advice, and though exhaustion clung to my bones, the fire of my resolve and the guidance of professionals carried me forward, building step by step the case that would one day expose the truth of what he had done, and protect her from ever falling into his cruelty again. The day of exposure came sooner than I expected, and it unfolded not with quiet whispers, but with a storm of truth that I had carefully prepared. And when it struck, there was no hiding for him, because every lie he had told, every excuse he had made, every moment of neglect he thought he had buried came flooding into the open where friends, family, and even the authorities could see. I had spent days collecting the accounts of doctors who described how long she had been left untreated, nurses who detailed her condition upon arrival, neighbors who had watched him vanish from the house night after night. And I had placed all of it carefully in the hands of a lawyer who knew how to wield truth like a weapon. When the confrontation finally happened, it was in the hospital itself where he showed up again, careless and smug, still believing that his charm or his dismissive laughter could silence the accusations. But this time he was not met with my weary anger alone. He was met with a circle of witnesses who had seen enough. The doctor spoke first, explaining bluntly that her condition was the direct result of being left without care, that this was not an illness that grew suddenly, but a decline that stretched over days. And I watched his smirk falter as the words cut through his facade. The neighbors spoke next, their voices steady as they described the nights he left, the parties they saw, the bottles in his hand, the carefree smile on his face while his wife wasted away behind closed doors. And he tried to wave them off with scoffs, but their words were too many and too strong. The lawyer then presented the statements, the medical records, the evidence of neglect, laying it all out in a way that could not be ignored. And for the first time I saw true panic flicker in his eyes. Family members who had once defended him, who had once believed his easy charm, now looked at him with disgust as the truth revealed itself piece by piece, and their silence spoke louder than any words, for it was the silence of those who no longer stood at his side. I stood back, not shouting, not raging, but letting the truth do the work I had prepared it to do, and I felt a grim satisfaction as his confidence crumbled. He tried to speak, tried to twist the story, claiming she had exaggerated, claiming she had been unwell before he left. But the voices of the professionals drowned him out, their authority undeniable, and every word he spoke sounded weaker against the strength of their testimony. The exposure was complete when the lawyer reminded him and everyone present that neglect was not just a moral failing but a legal matter, that what he had done was not only cruel but punishable. And the look on his face then was one I will never forget, the look of a man who realized his games had ended. My daughter lay in the bed beside us, too weak still to raise her own voice. But she did not need to, because the truth spoke for her. And I stood by her side, gripping her hand tightly, as if to tell her that justice was finally beginning to take shape. The exposure burned through every lie like fire through dry wood, leaving nothing but the raw, ugly reality of who he was. And though my heart ached for the pain she had endured, I also felt a deep sense of vindication, because now he could no longer hide behind charm or excuses. The witnesses, the records, the voices of those who had seen, all stood as a wall of truth too strong for him to climb. And in that moment I knew that the battle was turning, that his betrayal would no longer remain in the shadows, but would be remembered by everyone who mattered. The consequences did not arrive all at once, but they came steadily like the slow turning of a great wheel that could not be stopped. And as each day passed after the truth was laid bare, I watched the walls close in on him. The man who had once strutted with arrogance, now forced to face the wreckage he had created. His friends, who had once welcomed him into their parties, now turned their backs, disgusted by the details that had spread, because neighbors talk, doctors talk, and soon everyone in the community knew that while his wife lay dying, he had been drinking on the beach. I saw the humiliation settle over him, the way whispers followed him when he walked into familiar places, the way even those who had once excused his behavior now shook their heads in quiet condemnation. Legal consequences soon followed, because the lawyer I had entrusted with our fight moved quickly, filing papers, presenting the evidence, and making it clear that neglect was not just shameful but actionable. He was summoned to answer for his failures, his finances investigated, his claims picked apart until he stood exposed not only as a negligent husband, but as a man who had squandered what little responsibility he had been given. I sat in the courtroom one morning, my daughter still recovering in the hospital but strong enough to know that justice was beginning, and I watched as he squirmed under the questions, his excuses sounding hollow, his voice growing weaker with every piece of evidence presented. The doctors testified calmly, describing her condition in detail, explaining how days of abandonment had left her near death, and the nurse who had first tended to her in the emergency room spoke with quiet fury about the state she had arrived in. The neighbors gave their accounts too, and I could see his face flush as the stories of his nights of indulgence were told in front of officials who wrote each word down with care. The financial records painted a picture just as damning, showing money spent on alcohol, bars, and entertainment, while bills for the household remained unpaid, and I felt a grim satisfaction that the truth was not only being spoken, but being proven in black and white. He tried to protest, tried to twist the story by blaming her for weakness, but the judge silenced him, reminding him that duty in marriage is not optional, that neglect is not excusable, and that love cannot be used as a mask for cruelty. The consequences deepened as fines were imposed, as orders were given that stripped him of the authority he once thought unshakable, and I knew then that his power over her life was slipping away. My daughter, though still frail, began to show signs of healing under steady care, and I sat with her, telling her gently that she would never again be left in his hands, that the law and her family stood with her now. The humiliation spread wider than the courtroom, reaching his workplace, his friends, even his relatives, and the man who had once laughed freely at parties now found doors closing to him, opportunities vanishing, his reputation in tatters. I did not rejoice in his downfall, because joy felt too shallow for the depth of what had been lost, but I did feel justice, and justice was enough. I thought of all the nights I had prayed for her survival, of the desperation that had driven me to gather every shred of proof, and now I saw the harvest of those efforts, a reckoning that ensured he could not slip back into her life without consequence. The consequences were not only his to bear but ours to endure as well, because the scars of his neglect would remain with her, but they were scars that could now heal without fear of reopening, and I held her hand tightly, whispering that the worst was behind us, that the wheel had turned and now it was carrying us towards safety. Now that the dust has settled, and I sit here in the quiet of my home with my daughter resting safely in the next room, I find myself reflecting on everything that has happened, on the long journey, from the night I received that call to the day justice finally stripped away the lies of the man who betrayed her. And in that reflection, I feel both the weight of sorrow and the lightness of vindication. I nearly lost her, nearly watched the years of sacrifice and love slip away in the silence of neglect, but I did not, because something inside me refused to surrender, and that refusal became the strength that carried us through. I think of the night I flew to Florida, my heart pounding with fear, of the moment I walked into her home and found her lying weak and pale, of the ambulance ride where I held her hand and begged her not to leave me, and I know those memories will haunt me for as long as I live. Yet they also remind me of how fiercely a father can fight when his child is in danger. I reflect on the betrayal of her husband, The man I had once trusted, the man I had once welcomed into my family, and I see now how blind I had been, how willing I was to believe in his promises even when the warning signs flashed before me. But that blindness ended the moment I found her abandoned, and it was replaced by a clarity that gave me purpose. The vindication does not lie in his humiliation. Though he has been stripped of respect, wealth, and reputation, it lies in the fact that my daughter is alive, that she is healing, that she now knows without doubt that she is not a burden, that she is loved, and that her father will always stand beside her. I think of the professionals who helped me, the doctors and nurses who spoke the truth, the lawyer who guided me through the labyrinth of law, the neighbors who stood as witnesses, and I realize that vindication was a collective effort, that justice is never won alone, but through the voices of many who refuse to be silent. I reflect on the countless nights I spent at her bedside in the hospital, whispering memories of her childhood, telling her stories from when she was small, reminding her of the love that had carried us both through dark times. And I know now that those words were as much for me as they were for her, because they reminded me that the bond between us could not be broken by betrayal. Vindication also lies in the future, in the days ahead where she can rebuild her life without the shadow of neglect, where she can find strength in her own worth, and where I can finally rest knowing she is safe. I do not fool myself into thinking the scars will vanish, because wounds of the heart leave marks as deep as any on the body. But scars are proof of survival, proof that she endured, and proof that I kept my promise to protect her. I reflect on my own life, on the years spent working, sacrificing, raising her alone after her mother passed, and though those years were hard, I see now that they gave me the resilience to face this final battle, and that in the end I was able to keep the vow I made long ago that I would never let the world take her from me without a fight. Vindication is not triumph. It is peace. And as I sit here now watching the sun set outside my window, I feel that peace settle into my bones. She is alive, she is healing, and the man who once endangered her has been revealed for who he truly is. I nearly lost my daughter, but I did not. And in saving her, I have also saved myself, because I know when my own time comes, I will leave this world with the certainty that I did not fail her, that I fought to the very end, and that love proved stronger than betrayal. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left